your own area?
Yes, we do.
How much is that, and has that run out, and that's why you've had to...
Well, we've... it's not run out because we've not used the foam yet. Because before we start an attack and fire this size, you need enough foam to sustain the attack for as long as you need to attack the fire. Because if you put some on and then stop and it reignites, you've just wasted your resources.
Sorry, at the back.
Sarah Hughes, Sky News. Could you give us an idea of just how big the cordon is at the moment, and how many people have been evacuated, and how long they will be out of their homes for?
Yes, difficult to describe it, but basically, obviously, the terminal itself, all the industrial estate around it, and it's round about, I suspect, about half a mile away from the site in total. But it depends on which side of the site you are, exactly the dimensions of the cordon.
And in terms of the people who are in refuge centres at the moment, at what stage would you imagine they would be able to return to their homes?
That's really a public health issue. Once we've had the air sampled around there, then we would hope of a rapid return. But we would really wait until the air, we'd advise people to wait until the air has been sampled. Certainly if those homes in the opposite direction to where the flume is going, I would hope that would be sooner rather than later. But I'm sure there'll be a public health announcement in regard to that as soon as we know.
Yeah. Mr Whiteley, there was an agency report earlier on today that suggested that there was some looting. Are you aware of that, or has there been any looting?
I'd have to say we're not aware of any looting. We have a significant number of police officers in those cordons who will ensure that looting doesn't take place, and if anybody contemplates that, and I've certainly no reason to believe they are doing, then they will be dealt with very severely. And in that respect, again, I'd like to thank particularly the Metropolitan Police, who've sent us many dozens of officers to assist with that function.
Mr. Wiltshire, when do you think you'll be launching the attack on the fire with this fire?
I think at best we're hours away from launching the attack, and at worst it could wait until daylight tomorrow morning.
And how many vehicles do you need, do you think, to deliver this foam simultaneously?
This is one of the questions we're asking the experts from the oil industry, because we're really looking, if you look at a storage farm as we are now, it's in 5 separate what they call bunded areas, so that's held within walls, and we're trying to work out whether we need to make 5 simultaneous attacks or whether we can work our way in, and it's that sort of information we're after.
We've got time for one more question.
Angela Knight from the St Albans Observer. I understand that people were pre-warned or actually at the depot before the first explosion and subsequently were evacuated after that. Is that true, and is that one of the main reasons why we're lucky enough not to have any fatalities at the site?
I confess at this stage it's too early to be certain. I mean, clearly we're debriefing witnesses at the moment, and that sort of fact will all be very clear tomorrow, but it's too early to say. Okay, can we call it a day at that? And Colin will obviously talk to you about details of any further press updates. Thank you. Colin.
We'll leave that press conference now. Chief Constable Frank Whiteley just ending that press conference. We just briefly crossed to Chris Eakin as well. Of course, that was we'll be going back to him in a few minutes' time. Just to summarise a little bit of what was said in that press conference, the fire chief there saying this was the largest incident of its kind in peacetime Europe. The number of casualties now confirmed as 43. 2 seriously injured, according to Chief Constable Frank Whiteley. Extensive traffic disruption, he said, and just again, listening to what the fire chief was saying there, that they are shortly, if they can, attack that fire. He thinks it might be a matter of hours at best. At worst, though, it could be at daybreak tomorrow. He was saying that to actually attack that fire, they need to use foam, which they have supplies of 250,000 litres of foam concentrate, which they will be mixing with water, which will then turn into millions and millions of litres of foam, which they will then apply to that fire. Let's go straight now to our correspondent John Brain, who's a little closer to the scene of those explosions this morning. And John, the flames still rising almost as high as they were when that explosion first took place.
Yes, Tim, we're about 60 feet above ground level at the moment on a hoist looking over the scene, about half a mile from the depot. Let's show you some close-ups of that fire still raging. Now, I must say, to the naked eye, that actually looks as though it's got worse in the past hour. You can see those orange flames billowing out into the smoke. Now, we're told that that situation is contained, that it's not going to spread beyond the depot, so there's no alarm for residents that it will spread further than it already has. But certainly, as I say, to the naked eye, that looks like, if anything, that it is actually getting worse. And of course, we heard in the news conference that it's going to be some time before they actually tackle it. They have to work out a coordinated approach using the foam concentrate, which will then be transferred into foam to spread onto that fire to try and deal with it. Other than that, their only hope is to actually let it burn itself out, and that would take a few days.
Each tank at that depot, John, we believe contains 3 million gallons of fuel. Just give us an idea. I mean, are you smelling that fire where you are at the moment, or is it because the smoke is blowing in a different direction? You can't actually sense anything of it at all at the moment?
No, curiously, Tim, nothing at all. Even though we're so close to this huge incident, we're not really smelling anything at all. The wind is blowing the other way, though we're told that the smoke is not considered toxic. Though anyone in its path obviously is being told to stay well out of it, and residents here are repeatedly being urged to stay indoors with their doors and windows closed. Now, not everyone is heeding that advice. There are quite a few people near where we are now who have just come out really to have a look at this, taking photographs and both with cameras and mobile phones. But obviously the big concern is that this smoke is staying so low, and for people obviously in its path, and that could cause problems. And the health authorities are on alert for that, and they say that samples of the smoke will have to be taken to see exactly what they're dealing with it. Yes, so at the moment, still very much a major incident which is continuing here.
OK, for now, John Brain, just about a quarter of a mile away from that blast site. Thank you very much indeed. Parts of the M1 are still closed for the latest on the traffic situation. Let's cross to BBC London's travel unit and Jules Wilson. Jules.
Thanks, Tim. Well, the Buncefield Oil Depot is on the A414 Breakspear that leads into Hemel Hempstead from the M1. The closure on the M1, you can see it behind me. Well, you could do before they move the camera, but it's in northbound at the moment at 6 for Bricket Wood. That's just south of the M25. That extends up to the A5 at junction 9. Southbound, the closure also in at the moment from junction 10 to 6, but the exit slips are closed at 11 and 12. That's Dunstable and Flitwick. And essentially, if you're already on the motorway from Milton Keynes, it's closed at junction 12, coming down from the northern perimeter of Luton. Also got a closure for the M10 between junction 7 for the M1 and 1 at St Albans. That's causing some queues towards the southbound closure there. Police are advising the A1 as the diversion route through Hertfordshire and Bedfordshire, and the M40 for Buckinghamshire. We have had a few major pile-ups there on those diversion routes, so pretty busy there. And for Hemel Hempstead itself, the A414 Breakspear Way obviously closed off as well. That's between junction 8 of the M1 and Leverstock Green Road. Also, many other closures in for Hemel Hempstead, particularly on the eastern side of town. Lots of the road surfaces have melted. Those closures are going to be in for some while. Now, surprisingly, public transport not looking too bad. Silverlink and Thameslink say that their trains are still on the move. Luton Airport, there's now access to the motorway from the to the airport rather from the M1. But for Heathrow, got a problem with the visibility, so do check before you travel, or if you're picking someone up from Heathrow at the moment. They've changed their stacking system. And lots of smoke actually now floating over central London. That's really affecting the roads, particularly the M25 at junction 22. Also reports of it over the A1 Barnet bypass, the Blackwall Tunnel and the Leytonstone area as well. And we're told those closures will probably stay in until at least tomorrow evening. That's it from me.
OK, Jules, thank you very much indeed for that extremely comprehensive update on the travel situation. Now, the explosions happened about 6 o'clock this morning, just after 6 o'clock. A series of explosions and more have been taking place throughout the course of the day, as police and fire teams were expecting. Well, tanker driver Paul Turner had just arrived for work at the Buncefield depot when the explosion happened. He was speaking to my colleague Joanna Gosling a little earlier.
I got to work this morning about 6 o'clock, pulled into the car park, and was walking up to get in the turnstiles to collect my vehicle. And as I got halfway, I just saw a huge ball of flame, which must have been all 50 metres across, followed by a huge bang explosion, loudest bang I've ever heard in my life. I'm not sure whether my knees buckled or whether the blast took me off my feet. I was sort of in shock. I just got up, ran back to my car as fast as I could. I'm not really thinking that my car could have been damaged, and I should have actually carried on running out of the building. Jumped in my car, started my car up, and got off site as quickly as I could. Got to a roundabout, stopped with some other drivers, a couple of BP drivers behind me, and we stopped there, had a look, and we just saw one of the tanks themselves shooting flames 40, 50 feet into the air.
Were you injured at all?
Well, no, I feel fine. I just landed on my backside and just got up and ran, you know. As I said, I'm not sure whether it was my legs that buckled, whether it was the force of the blast, which I did feel, and the building that I was walking next to was shook, the ground shook, and I just got up and scarpered, really.
Could you see where the explosion had actually happened?
It looked like it happened behind the loading racks where the drivers go up to load, where I could have been at 6 o'clock this morning, but for going in yesterday and preloading my vehicle for this morning just to make life easier for myself so I wouldn't have to queue up, because sometimes there can be a bit of a queue for the loading racks because there are Shell drivers, Texaco drivers, Tesco drivers and all sorts of people loading up there. So to avoid that this morning, I preloaded my vehicle yesterday, but I would have been there at 6 o'clock when the explosion happened. So
just describe for us in more detail, if you can. You describe it, you think it was behind the loading racks. What exactly is in that area?
There are 8 to 10 racks where we pull onto the bait and connect hoses to load our vehicles up when we're going to the different petrol stations or schools, farms and that sort of thing. I would say 50 to 100 feet behind that is the first big tank. Now, I don't know if it was that tank that went up, but there are 3 or 4 dotted around that are actually behind that, so it could have been one of them. We just couldn't see from there. So if you were on the loading racks when it went up, I'm just concerned for our drivers there might have been a bit of trouble there.
It was clearly a catastrophic explosion. We can see the scale of it from our pictures. How much fuel might have been in those tanks at the time?
Well, I've been told that each tank can hold up to 3 million gallons. So that is a hell of a lot of fuel, and I don't see how any firefighters can actually get near to that to fight it, because the heat will be so intense.
They can hold up to 3 million gallons. Would they have been full at that time?
That I don't know. The technicians would know, but they could well have been full at that time. Could well have been.
And we heard earlier that the oil depot itself is actually divided into 2 sections. One is for aviation fuel and the other is for domestic fuel. Was this on the aviation side?
I don't think so. I think it was on the side of the fuel for cars. I don't think it was aviation fuel, because that goes through pipelines. I'm not sure where those tanks are in relation to where the explosion were, but I think it was, as I said, for like the Totals and the Pace drivers of this world.
So how much activity would have been going on at that site at the time?
At that time, drivers, barring Total drivers who normally are in and out of there by 5 o'clock, I would have been up there, Texaco drivers would have been up there, Tesco's drivers. Most drivers go up there and load. The shift normally starts about 6 o'clock. So there could have been a few on the loading rack.
And as you were leaving, were the flames already reaching high into the sky? How long did it take to really take hold?
Virtually straight away. By the time it took me to drive a quarter of a mile down to the roundabout, turn around, the flames were shooting up into the air. The first thing I saw was the flames, and then the bang, and then more flames after that by the time I got to the roundabout.
That was Paul Daniel speaking to my colleague Joanna Gosling this morning. Let's just show you the pictures, the live pictures we're getting from our helicopter now, where those flames are still burning intensely, perhaps more fiercely, in fact, in some places than other parts. In fact, this isn't from a helicopter, this is a fixed shot, I think, from one of our masts close to the area. That thick black smoke now still pouring into the sky, a slick a cloud which has spread right over central London, East London, and will be making its way towards Europe. There are fears. We were speaking to our weather presenter Dan Corbett a little earlier on, and he was saying that come dusk, there are fears now that actually that smoke might fall to the ground and lead to particles, hydrocarbons falling down on anything underneath. Let's just leave, though, these live pictures and look at these. This is the scene in the immediate aftermath of those explosions just after 6 o'clock this morning. And you can see here just how close this cameraman got. Really, just a matter of a few hundred feet. The heat must be absolutely intense from that blaze there. And you just get an idea of the scale and also the shock waves that followed that explosion. And you see the damage to the buildings around it. Windows blown out, concrete blown away, bricks blown away. So these are the pictures immediately after, and then this is what it did to housing and property in local areas. The sound of this explosion was heard as far away as France and Holland. So you can imagine quite what the impact was on housing and property in the immediate vicinity of the Buncefield oil depot. Here we see a cinema which was used as an evacuation centre for some of those people caught up in the immediate vicinity of those blasts. Some 2,000 people were evacuated. Police are saying that they cannot rule out that more people will need to be evacuated later on. Let's just go back, though, having seen these evacuation shots, let's just go back to those pictures taken. Well, these are the live pictures now, but also some of those immediate aftermath pictures that we saw, which we still have a few more of there. And you just get a sense of just how intense that explosion was, a series of explosions. And you see, in fact, remarkably, one tank there still intact, but the others around it burning out of control. And that fuel, those tanks containing, 3 million gallons of fuel each, those tanks still burning what is left of it. Quite remarkable pictures. Just to our viewers who perhaps are just joining us now, this is the scene immediately after that first series of explosions, just after 6 o'clock this morning at the Buncefield fuel depot, one of the largest fuel depots in the country, the fifth out of some 500 depots. Hundreds of millions of gallons of aviation fuel and petrol stored at that site. Quite an important site in the network, in the grid of fuel depots right around the country. These pictures sent in to us earlier on today. For any of you perhaps who have pictures that you've taken, please do send them to us here at the BBC, and we will try and get them on air as soon as we can. The Deputy Prime Minister, we're just hearing, John Prescott, is on his way to the scene. This incident being described by fire chiefs as the largest incident of its kind in peacetime Europe. Watching these pictures with me in the studio is Jeff Daniels, an engineer and expert on the fuel industry, who's been with us throughout the course of the day. And just looking at those pictures, I mean, you realise what a blast and the intensity of the flames there.
Absolutely. If anything, looking at the pictures that are coming in now, the situation seems to be getting worse rather than better. But it's worth emphasising, when you look at the shots that were taken first thing this morning, that 100 gallons of spilled petrol vaporised plus a spark is the equivalent of a pretty large conventional bomb.
We must just say that we don't know quite what caused this, but
indeed we don't.
So that is speculation. But as you were saying, just looking at the pictures, the live pictures that we've had in the last few minutes, when you hear the Chief Fire Officer at Hertfordshire say that he hopes that he'll get things under control perhaps by tomorrow morning, do you think he's being slightly optimistic?
Well, frankly, I do. Mind you, he says very carefully he hopes to make a start first thing tomorrow morning.
That's with the foam.
When he's got his foam assets fully in place. What he needs, as he said, he needs to be confident that he's got enough foam on site that once he starts attacking, he can push the thing through to a conclusion. Because if you get halfway through and run out of fuel, run out of foam, then you withdraw, and before you know what's happened, the fire is back as big as it was when you started. It's just a complete waste.
Remarkably few casualties, Jeff, as we see those pictures there. Is that because a depot like this is largely automated, and I suppose also at 6 o'clock in the morning not that many people would be on site anyway?
Well, it has to be said that insofar as this could have happened at a good time, this was probably a good time. 6 o'clock on a winter Sunday morning has got to be something like the optimum. But of course the site is pretty well fully automated. Somebody said to me that they reckon there were actually 9 people on site, and I said, well, yes, and 5 of those will have been security. There's just 2 of them in the control room, pushing the buttons and monitoring the situation. And the sad thing is that something in their monitoring system didn't fully tell them what was going on.
Patrick Bartlett, our business correspondent, joins me in the studio as well. Patrick, we're hearing that the Deputy Prime Minister, John Prescott, is on his way to the scene. Let's just look at, there have been some reports that people have been panic buying petrol. All the authorities are saying, please don't do that. But what impact is this fire going to have, this explosion going to have on petrol supplies?
Well, Buncefield is a very large terminal. It's the 5th largest in the country, so it supplies a huge area of southeastern England with fuel, and that fuel is now going to have to come from other storage facilities. So there's a huge logistical challenge there for the oil companies, and I understand that they have been holding an emergency telephone conference call this afternoon to try to work out how they're going to handle that. They are insisting that because no refinery is involved, that there's actually no shortage of fuel, so it's really just a question of getting it to where it's needed. And while that may be difficult in the short term, they are confident that any problems will only be short-lived, and there is no justification, they say, for panic buying.
Patrick, as we see these queues of motorists outside petrol stations, let's just tell people who are just watching us that there has been this series of explosions at Buncefield Fuel Depot, which started this morning just after 6 o'clock. Remarkably, only 39 or 43 people injured, 2 of them seriously. The Deputy Prime Minister, John Prescott, is on his way to the scene. He'll be going to Hertfordshire Police headquarters. He'll also be going as close to the scene as possible. This is the scene live. The explosion happened at 6:03. There was a chain of explosions, as we have seen some from those remarkable pictures by that cameraman, that amateur cameraman who got extremely close this morning. And we can see those pictures now, but those flames are continuing. As Jeff Daniels, the engineer and expert on the fuel industry, who's still with me in the studio now, is saying to his eye, it looks as if those flames have intensified. Emergency services saying that half the site is on fire, the other half is under control, but fire officers who are saying this is the largest incident of its kind in peacetime Europe are suggesting that perhaps they might not be able to attack that fire until perhaps tomorrow morning daybreak, when they will try and put as much foam over the fire. But basically the idea seems to be to let it burn itself out. Patrick, it's not just petrol that's being stored at this site, it's also aviation fuel. Is the picture the same there in terms of shortage of supply and impact on the aviation industry?
Well, it's slightly more complicated in that Buncefield supplies Heathrow, for instance, with fuel through a pipeline. That's kerosene from a slightly different site, but as I understand at the moment, that pipeline has been shut down. Heathrow say they have 48 hours supply of fuel on site, and that Heathrow only provides them with about a third of their needs anyway. They're confident that they will be able to find alternative supplies, principally, I think, from the big Forley terminal near Southampton. But obviously, if it's out of action for a long time, that could pose problems for the airport.
Jeff, police are saying they believe it was an accident. They're keeping an open mind. You've been around a lot of depots and terminals like this. how could something like this happen, and what sort of precautions are in place at big depots such as Buncefield?
Oh, all kinds of precautions, the human precautions, making sure that nobody takes any source of fire on site, making sure that people guard against generating static electricity.
Just explain how they do that. I mean, how do you guard against static...
You wear special shoes and a special coat that discharges before it can do any damage.
And that will apply, will it, to tanker drivers who are going in to collect?
It certainly should do, yes. Tanker drivers, of course, very safety conscious people, take precautions such as earthing their tankers before they start to fill up, another very important precaution. On the side of containment, it's really just a matter of good housekeeping, and these regulations are laid down in enormous detail. The kind of thing, what things have to be made of, how they have to be designed, how often they have to be inspected. It's all in the book. The book is several hundred pages thick, and no doubt after the inquiry into this incident there will be a few more pages added.
Have safety procedures changed that much? I mean, Buncefield, one reads, was started operating in 1968, I think, so the late 1960s. Have things improved, been tightened up substantially since then?
Well, from every incident, every disaster, we learn something, and these major terminals are always updated throughout their lives. New precautions are introduced, put into the book, and they're immediately acted upon, and changes are made within the terminal.
Okay, Jeff Daniels, thank you very much indeed. I think we'll be speaking to you throughout the course of the evening. Also Patrick Bartlett, our business correspondent. Let's just show you those live pictures once more from the scene at Hemel Hempstead. And you can see the smoke still rising now into the sky as dusk approaches. It's gone over central London. It's on its way to Europe. And there is a risk, we were speaking to our weather presenter a little earlier, there is a risk that some of those particles come dusk will actually fall to the ground. Well, let's go back now to some of the remarkably dramatic eyewitness accounts and indeed those people who lived close to the explosions this morning, what they heard. Spencer Eames, who's a local resident, told Joanna Gosling earlier that he managed to get extremely close to the blast.
I'm in a state about a quarter of a mile away from the actual incident. And this morning we woke up to a massive explosion and wondered what it was. So we all got up and had a look out the window and realised what the situation was, because it was in the area of the oil refinery. And I went over there across the fields and took some footage, which was about 100 yards away from the back end of the actual depot. And the heat was just unbelievably intense. That my face was burning. You had to shield your eyes from the heat. It was just tremendous.
And the scenes must have been dramatic that close by.
Well, yeah, I mean, there was at that time about 6:20 in the morning, and there's me and a friend of mine that were there. And one of the buildings that you see on the TV at the moment, or recently, the white building, is absolutely devastated. The actual back end of it, which backs onto the actual depot.
And what was happening at that stage? Because obviously very early in the morning, but many, many people woken up by this. Were others doing as you were doing and coming out and seeing what was happening?
Well, yeah, I mean, the whole estate was like out and about, walking around asking questions and speculating as to what was going on. But a few of us, obviously went a bit further and actually come over the fields to actually see what, to see like a better view. And the closer we got, the heat was just so intense. Couldn't believe it, and people, houses and flats where the windows have been smashed in, the actual window frames have been broken and all sorts. It's terrible.
Has there been damage to your own home?
Well, amazingly, my house wasn't touched, but both my neighbours either side suffered damage to their houses, I just couldn't believe that my house wasn't touched.
So what are you doing now? Are you just having to stay inside your house with the doors and windows shut? What's happening? We see this huge cloud of smoke.
Basically, yeah, we've been told to keep the windows shut and to stay indoors and just wait for any news. Now obviously it's daylight, you can see that the cloud of smoke is right above the houses, and it's like a scene out of some kind of a war film,
Have you been told that you may have to leave your home? Because we gather that some areas have actually been evacuated.
When we came down from the actual area where I was filming the fire, we came down to a police cordon, and they said to us that that they were considering a 10-mile radius of evacuation, but they will contact people as and when. So no one's contacted us just yet.
Spencer Eames speaking to my colleague Joanna earlier on today. Let's just show you that fire is still raging away near Hemel Hempstead at the Buncefield depot. Fire chiefs are saying that they expect it to continue burning for another 24 hours or so. There's really very little they can do with that at the moment apart from try and contain it. They've got to try and let it burn itself out as much as possible before covering it with foam. Much more on that, of course, throughout the course of this afternoon. Let's get a weather update before we go back, though.